Thank you, Andrew. I just want to start by noting, I realize that I am the last speaker at what I think has been just a really fantastic conference and has been incredibly well run, and I just want to thank all of the organizers and everyone involved with this. This has just been fantastic. I also realize that, I know that none of them are in the room right now, but I do think at some point we should give a big shout out, thank you, applaud to all of the wonderful staff that have been so enormously helpful, at least to me as a non-native, non-German speaker, but the amazing people that work here at the hotel and the restaurant have been amazing, so I will just note that as well. So I am just thrilled to be here this evening. This is, as I said, it's been an amazing program. And I'm very excited to be able to talk about these issues. You know, for far too long, it seems that economists haven't really taken economic inequality as seriously as we needed to. And so it's exciting to see so many of us doing that. And I want to start with a little example. In 2010, I watched a video of a speech that Paul Krugman gave at a Luxembourg Income Study conference. And in that video, he starts his speech by sort of recalling these stories about how prior to the economic crisis, people would ask him, like, oh, he'd show this chart on inequality, and people would say, oh, well, inequality is as high today in the U.S. as it was in 1929. Does that mean we're going to have another Great Depression? And he sort of said in this speech, I used to say, nah, that's not likely, not going to happen. But now it seems like there's a coincidence, and maybe we should take that seriously. And I think, you know, that was back in 2010, but I think it's sort of worth noting that so many of us didn't. But of course, we cannot deny the facts, and I know we all know all of these by now, that, you know, over the past half century, we've seen this enormous increase in income inequality, especially with the top pulling further and further away from the rest of us. And you know, part of the reason I think folks like Paul Krugman and many economists didn't take inequality as seriously is because for so long there was this sort of presumption that developed economies would just become more equal over time. I think there was a little bit of a delayed reaction to the rise in inequality. So, you know, as president of the American Economics Association in 1955, Simon Kuznets hypothesized about this long-run relationship between inequality and growth. And he pointed to a set of data that he compiled that led him to make this conclusion that after reaching a certain level of economic development, countries would become more equal, because that's what was happening in the world at the time. And of course, we all know now that in hindsight, that trend towards greater economic inequality was in fact temporary, and in many ways maybe was an aberration due to the economic consequences that had happened in the early part of the 20th century. This is, of course, the conclusion that Thomas Piketty comes to after using a very similar data method and the kinds of data that Simon Kuznets had used. And as we all at this conference by now know, these are the kinds of conclusions in terms of the data that the World Top Incomes database has shown us, that the period of greater equality in the developed economies in the mid-20th century was transient. So I would argue that what we've been talking about over the past few days are among the most important questions of our times, and ones that we need answers to, because clearly we had it wrong before. And this is where I'll start one of a number of plugs for my organization. This is why we were founded. I am running a project called the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, where we are investigating whether and how economic inequality affects economic growth and stability, with the purpose of making that research accessible and available to policymakers. Because it's one thing to sort of say that inequality affects the economy. It's quite another thing to actually have a sense of what we can do about it. So on the first evening of this conference, Jonathan Austry, who works for, of course, one of the most important global economic policymaking institutions, the International Monetary Fund, he showed us the findings of his recent research that he's done with his colleagues on the implications of redistribution for economic growth and stability. And there were 2 points that he raised that I think provide a nice starting place for my remarks. Now, first, he showed how his research finds that in his analysis, the coefficient on redistribution is not only not negative, wow, that is a lot of negatives, it's not larger than inequality. And he pointed out that this invalidates Arthur Oken's notion of a leaky bucket. Second, during the Q&A, when asked about policy, he said, quote, regressions will not inform the actions of the fund. And he kind of laughed a little bit because someone in the audience had asked whether or not his regressions were having an impact. And he's like, regressions do not change the minds of policymakers, but they can inform the debate. And I think that in the second half of my remarks will focus on other ways I think we need to be thinking about how we advise policymakers on these big issues. But let me start with a few remarks reminding us what Oken's leaky bucket was all about, because I think there's some important ideas in here. So there's been a long tradition in economics arguing that any policy that reduces inequality would be counterproductive, and we heard quite a little bit about this in the earlier remarks on taxation. Now, Oken summarized this book in his 1975 book, Equality and Efficiency, The Big Trade-Off. And I wanted to just give a little bit of a quote here. Quote, the contrasts among American families in living standards and in material wealth reflect a system of rewards and penalties that is intended to encourage effort and channel it into socially productive activity. To the extent that the system succeeds, it generates an efficient economy. But that pursuit of efficiency necessarily creates inequalities, and hence society faces a trade-off between equality and efficiency. This trade-off happens because monetary rewards and penalties, that is, economic incentives, drive productive activity. If you pay people more, or if you perhaps pay them at all, they will work harder and they'll be more productive. These rewards and penalties are then optimal for growth, and any economic interventions are distortionary and will lower economic growth. That's the basic thesis. We might want to address inequality for political or humanitarian reasons, but certainly not for economic ones. So this idea, right, that inequality is about financial incentives has a long history in economics. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that keeping wages down for some workers would result in inequality that was, quote, upon the whole, perhaps rather advantageous rather than hurtful to the public. So there's also a long tradition of seeing capital accumulation as a positive side effect of inequality. Inequality means some people can amass big piles of money and then they can be very patient with those investments, and we think that that drives economic growth. But Austry's work and the work of many of you at this conference and many other economists contradicts this conclusion. Last month, Mike Carter Price and I released a very short literature review reviewing the literature on inequality and growth. And what we found is that this literature was generally inconclusive until about 5 or 10 years ago, but more recent data and methods are showing the kinds of findings that Jonathan Austry talked about, that over the long term, as inequality increases, it drags down economic growth and reduces economic stability. And a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference with Sarah Wojciechowski, who's done research in this space and who wrote a very nice review of the literature a few years ago. She told me that she's still tracking the literature, and she has a big Excel spreadsheet with 72 studies that regress inequality on growth, and has found that overall it appears that inequality is bad for growth over the long term. And I want to just point to one other paper that I think is relevant. It'll come in later in my remarks, by Roy van der Ried and Branko Milanovic, who do us a great service by putting the headline, which is sort of a key for policymakers, putting the headline result of the paper in the title of the paper, quote, inequality is bad for the growth of the poor, but not for that of the rich. And in this paper, they find that when they look at the effect of growing inequality, they find that it is bad for the incomes of lower and medium income households, but doesn't affect income growth for those at the top. Yet, as Austry said, regressions are only going to take us so far with policymakers. So even if we think that there is this negative relationship between inequality and growth, especially over the long term, how should we be thinking about it? And many of the terrific papers and panels that I've attended at this conference focus on different pieces of the puzzle. And I wanted to focus the conversation in the next few minutes, bringing our attention to some of what are in many cases microeconomic, but some macroeconomic channels that it can explain this overall macroeconomic finding. So it's to these specific channels to which I now want to turn. And I'm going to frame the rest of my remarks in terms of some research that I think that will be most helpful for policymakers so that we don't just understand the macro story, but we can tell them how and why this is the case. So my organization, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, is not just a think tank, but we are also a grant-making institution. And we announced our first call for proposals on November 15th of 2013, and we gave out that first round this summer. And I think we've funded some actually very exciting work. And we're focusing our grant making in 4 areas: human capital, consumption, institutions, and entrepreneurship. In our first round of grant making, and I will note that we're about to put out our second call for proposals in I think 2 weeks. So if you're interested, please check out our website or talk to me after this. But we're funding research in only 3 of the 4 areas that we put out the first request for proposals in. And before going into the 3 that we are funding, I wanted to sort of note why we're only funding 3, not 4. We received no grant proposals in the area of entrepreneurship. That is, we received no proposals from economists or other scholars on whether and how inequality affects entrepreneurship, which of course affects the economy more generally. Now, I don't think economists, many of us don't spend a lot of time as economists thinking about what creates the drive or the capacity for someone to go out on their own and start a new business or take a risk. It's typically business school folks or folks that certainly aren't macroeconomists who think about that. But I think that this is an area that we should be focusing more of our attention, if for no other reason that provides really good stories to help us understand actually how the economy works on a human scale. One of the things that I learned while doing a literature review in this area a couple of years ago is that when you look at the people who are rich today, who are entrepreneurs, most of them actually come from middle-class families. The Kaufman Foundation found that less than 1% of all entrepreneurs come from either very rich or very poor backgrounds. That's a very compelling finding, and it flies in the face of some of our textbook economic predictions about incentives and capital accumulation. I think it's something that we need to have more research on and look into. So I want to turn to the 3 other potential channels for thinking about how inequality affects economic growth and stability. And being here at this conference, at the Research Network Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policies Conference, that is a mouthful, I first want to start with demand. But I want to start with a little bit of a story here before, because I think it's enlightening about the role of demand management in the United States. Brad DeLong blogs for us at Equitable Growth, and in one of our meetings a couple of months ago, he shared an anecdote from his time as a policymaker. He served as an economist with the U.S. Treasury and in the early years of the Clinton administration. And he said that when the new administration came into power, there was a conscious decision to take issues of demand off the table. They assumed that the Federal Reserve, under the able leadership of Alan Greenspan, would take care of the issue, and that it was the role of the Treasury and the rest of the federal government to act on boosting supply-side capacity through education and other policies. Now, as we all know, that decision may have had, certainly that decision had consequences, but it may not have been the right one. The United States was about to enter a period of bubble-driven economies. In the late 1990s, of course, we had the stock market and tech bubble, and then, of course, the housing bubble of the 2000s. And understanding the role of demand for policymakers outside of the Federal Reserve may be an important thing to be thinking about. I want to highlight some research that I have found compelling, especially compelling on demand in the economy, and the folks that I've had dinner with a couple of nights ago already heard me talking about that, so I apologize to you. But I've become a little obsessed with the work of Atif Mian and Amir Sufi. They have done a series of papers and then a book, a very accessible, very nicely written book called House of Debt, where they show how the increase in household debt during the 2000s led to the Great Recession because of the distribution of that debt. They fundamentally connect rising inequality and differences in net worth across households with consumption patterns, and then connect that to the drivers of the Great Recession in the United States. They point out that from 2002 to 2005, credit increased most among households where income was falling. The rise in credit and household income was negatively correlated. And the counties with the largest declines in total net worth were the ones where spending dropped the most as the housing bubble popped. So they, using a lot of very detailed data and sort of big data, they've been able to show that inequality played a direct role in the way that the recession played out in the United States, which I think is a really important finding. It's also very interesting because they used microeconomic data, and in their case, data on mortgage lending and credit ratings, to understand the economy and then build up to macroeconomic conclusions that, as they argue, are not consistent with what many macroeconomists think. So I want to turn now to what I think is the most intuitive way that we can think through how inequality affects economic growth, which is human capital. That is, of course, the development of workers' skills and abilities. And you can tell I talk a lot to policymakers because I always have to explain all of my economic terms. Now, inequality of income and wealth may create a situation where only those born into high income or high wealth families could truly develop their talents. And there is some very depressing evidence in the United States documenting how this appears to be increasingly the case. Sean Reardon, who's a sociologist at Stanford University, has done some work showing that the growing gap in educational attainment, educational test scores across the United States, and that this gap has been increasing over the past 30 years or so. Now, among other things, he finds that rising educational inequality in the United States is for the most part a story of the top of the distribution pulling away from the rest. The gap between the outcomes for children of the rich households and outcomes for children of middle-income households is growing much faster than for any other group. Part of this increase, about half of it, about 50%, is due to the increasing incomes going to households. But the other 50% is due to an increasing correlation between income and educational attainment. In other words, an extra dollar of income buys more educational success than it did in the past. Now, I've been in a number of sessions over the past few days, and of course during the first plenary session on Thursday evening, yes, where the question has come up about why people borrowed so much money as credit became available during the 2000s. And the answer that we heard in this room a few nights ago was a version of Robert Frank's aspirational consumption hypothesis. But I think that there are other things going on here, especially in terms of educational attainment and the capacity that families have to invest in the next generation, both in terms of schooling, but also the time resources that families have. And we've already heard tonight about how the changes in wage inequality are connected to what's happened inside households. In the U.S. case, we've certainly left families to flounder as they've put more workers into the labor market, but haven't had the kind of supports that actually allow them to attend to what the next generation needs. When you combine that with the kind of research that Sean Reardon has done, he finds that the main driver of the gap in education is that rich children enter kindergarten much more prepared for school than the children of middle and low-income households. The inequality in education among children ages 0 to 5 occurs before children even enter the classroom. So a policy response to this inequality may rest less on the current education in the the current educational system in the United States and more on the period before primary school, or addressing the kinds of workplace scheduling flexibility or workplace supports that families need in order to have these dual income families. And I'll come back to that at the very end of my comments. So I want to turn briefly to the last channel, which is institutions. So of the three channels through which inequality might affect, four potential channels through which inequality might affect growth, this one is certainly the most, I think, the least well understood among economists, but also I think for many of us it's very interesting. And my thinking on this issue about the role of institutions most recently has been heavily influenced by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail. Now, before you groan, for those of you who might want to do that, I think that this book has a simple yet powerful explanation for what drives long-run economic growth. They argue that societies that create inclusive institutions, or institutions that encourage and allow for broad participation in economic and political life, are more likely to be prosperous. It's a very simple hypothesis, and it is incredibly difficult to actually prove. It's very, it's very ethereal almost. And many of my friends who are experts on the specific countries profiled in the book have, have given me long lectures about how this book wasn't exactly right on their country. And many economist friends found the book a bit light on the data or on the evidence. But what I found so interesting is that the book calls for us to think seriously and critically about the intersection between economics and institutions, and that they argue that power matters for economic outcomes. And while that might not be the most revolutionary idea in the world, people have said that before, but I do think it's very important that a book that got as much traction as theirs starts from that premise. I think one of the questions that we want to be digging into over the next couple of years is how to actually sort of dig deep and understand what they mean by institutions, what those actually are. I think certainly in the U.S. case, we can say that we are moving away from inclusive institutions in a variety of ways. And to give you one example, a number of political scientists have been looking to the role of inequality on political decision-making in our democracy in the United States. And here I'm thinking specifically of work by Larry Bartels and Martin Gilens. One of their findings that I find most troubling is that in the United States, legislation does not become law unless the rich favor it. If the policy preferences of those at the top are aligned with the rest of society, then the policy is likely to be enacted. But if the preferences of those at the top differ from the rest of society, then the wishes of those at the top are the ones that become law. That is, the wealthy hold the trump card. Okay, so now that I've cast doubt on the ability of the American political system to enact policies that might favor the broad population over the wealthy few, I'd like to suggest a few policy options that might help reduce inequality while boosting economic growth or stability. And I'm going to focus this by suggesting policies that affect the income distribution at the bottom, the middle, and the top. I think for policymakers, and it's even sort of thinking about policies, it's really hard to wrap your head around something that will affect the entire income distribution. So I think it's a little bit easier to break it down into buckets. So in the United States, and I apologize for those of you who are not Americans, I am very much a domestic U.S.-focused person, so all of my examples here are U.S.-based in terms of policy, but hopefully we can still talk about them. So for families at the bottom of the income distribution in the U.S., an increase in the minimum wage would, of course, be a welcome policy. Our federal minimum wage, although I know other countries don't have it, ours has not been raised in many years. And in the long run, the purchasing power has decreased substantially since its peak in the late 1960s. And we know that the lack of increase of the U.S. minimum wage has contributed substantively to inequality at the bottom of the income distribution. According to an estimate by David Otter, Alan Manning, and Christopher Smith, 30 to 50% of the increase in the ratio of the 50th percentile of wages to the 10th percentile since the early 1980s has been due to the declining value of the minimum wage. The minimum wage can be a very potent tool for increasing earnings at the bottom, but it is and reducing inequality, and we in the United States have not been taking advantage of this enough. And in terms of economic growth, the minimum wage is far from a quote-unquote job killer. In the United States, so the term job killer is sort of the new term of art to describe Arthur Oken's leaky bucket. Any policy that addresses inequality is a quote-unquote job killer because you have this equity efficiency trade-off. So I'm going to use job killer for the rest of my remarks here. So in terms of whether or not the minimum wage is a job killer, careful empirical research, and a ton of it, right? The U.S. minimum wage is the most studied policy in all of labor economics. But the empirical research has found that moderate increases in the minimum wage have no discernible effect on employment at all. So turning to the middle of the income distribution, here again, especially in the United States, job quality is a critically important policy issue. And it's not just about wages. Of course, wages are important, but the issue is not only about wages. We need to look at the economic realities facing middle-class families by focusing on policies that help parents manage their responsibilities both to the workplace and to their families. And this is exactly the place where Sean Reardon's research points to. And there are a variety of policy issues, but one is the increasing inequality of educational outcomes, and that this inequality starts at a very young age. So one way would be for us to increase our investments in early childhood education, specifically universal pre-kindergarten for all children, as well as policies that help low and middle-income families learn and practice the parenting skills that contribute to better educated and socially equipped babies and toddlers. And I would add to that policies that allow parents to balance work and family in a way that is good for both the adults and the children in those families. These investments could help reduce the gap in skills between children of well-off families and those at the middle and the bottom of the income spectrum in the United States. We know that investments in early education have very large returns, and we know this from a wide variety of economic literature, many of which experimented on very young children in the late 1960s and early 70s and found out that actually if you put poor children into good high-quality pre-kindergarten, they turn out better as adults. But I also wonder if there are ways to connect the dots, if there would be macroeconomic effects in some ways. If universal pre-kindergarten affected the aspirational needs of families struggling with the implications of high inequality, would there be macroeconomic implications of this? If the aspirational needs that we were talking about in terms of why families took on so much debt, if some of that was about education, but some of it was also about early childhood education, then there may be a connection there, and I would be very eager to hear from anyone who has thought about that. And as for the top of the income distribution, let's talk about taxes. Yes, of course, Stefan covered the landscape on this, so I have nothing new to add in terms of tax ideas because that's all been said. I will note that I am a fan. If I could just invoke Dean Baker, who used to be my boss for a number of years, who's a huge fan of the financial transaction tax. I don't feel like I could stand up on a podium being the person in this role a year later without saying that that would be, I think, a very interesting way to address incomes at the top. In 2005 in the United States, 18% of taxpayers in the top 0.1% of the income spectrum were employed in the financial industry, an increase of 7 percentage points since 1979. We know that the financial sector has played a huge role in rising inequality and in rising economic instability. Given its role, a small financial transactions tax may be a way to go. I've also been working with Emmanuel Saez is on the board of my organization, and we've done some work with Thomas Piketty and been talking to them about ideas around taxation. I'm very interested, too, in thinking about the ways that we need to coordinate internationally, especially on taxing at the top. So I'm going to end my remarks with a request for your help. So my center is focused on elevating and promoting economic research and from other disciplines, but economic research generally, that helps us understand how economic inequality in all its forms affects the economy. And we are interested in this question because, at least in my experience in the United States, the primary reason that policymakers are not implementing policies that reduce inequality is because they fear these policies will be job killers or that they will be labeled a job killer themselves. I've worked in Washington, D.C. at think tanks and in policy positions since 2000, and if I've heard this argument about job killers once, I feel like I've heard it a million times. Quite frankly, I'm sick of it, and I could use all of your help on pushing back on it. We need to be identifying the best, most exciting, cutting-edge, new research, especially empirical economics, that we can be using to rebut this job killer argument. I hope that, I've sketched out a few of the potential ways through which inequality may affect economic growth, and I believe that many of these can be fairly persuasive to policymakers. But I am much more interested in the truth than any of my own pet theories on how inequality affects economic growth and stability. And so I think that we need to make sure at all times we are focusing on getting a better understanding of how inequality is affecting the economy, as well as what we could do about it. With that, I will end.